Bears and Dacoits, A Tale of the Cats, by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1. A merry party was sitting in the veranda of one of the largest and handsomest bungalows of Poona. It belongs to Colonel Hastings, colonel of a native regiment stationed there, and at present, in virtue of seniority, commanding a brigade. Tiffin was on, and 3 or 4 officers and 4 ladies had taken their seats in the comfortable cane lounge chairs, which form the invariable furniture of the veranda of a well-ordered bungalow. Permission had been duly asked and granted by Mrs. Hastings, and the cheroots had just begun to draw, when Miss Hastings, a niece of the colonel, who had only arrived the previous week from England, said, "Uncle, I'm quite disappointed. Mrs. Lyons showed me the bear she'd got tied up in their compound, and it's the most wretched little thing, not bigger than Rover, Papa's retriever, and it's full grown. I thought bears were great fierce creatures, and this poor little thing seemed so restless and unhappy that I thought it quite a shame not to let it go." Colonel Hastings smiled rather grimly. "And yet, small and insignificant as that bear is, my dear, it's a question whether he is not as dangerous an animal to meddle with as a man-eating tiger." "What, that wretched little bear, uncle?" "Yes, that wretched little bear. Any experienced sportsman will tell you that hunting those little bears is as dangerous a sport as tiger hunting on foot, to say nothing of tiger hunting from an elephant's back, in which there is scarcely any danger whatever. I can speak feelingly about it, for my career was pretty nearly brought to an end by a bear, just after I entered the army, some 30 years ago, at a spot within a few miles from here. I've got the scars on my shoulder and arm still." "Oh, do tell me all about it," Miss Hastings said, and the request being seconded by the rest of the party, none of whom, with the exception of Mrs. Hastings, had ever heard the story before, for the colonel was somewhat chary of relating his special experience, he waited till they had all drawn up their chairs as close as possible, and then, giving 2 or 3 vigorous puffs at his cheroot, began as follows. 30 years ago, in 1855, things were not as settled in the Deccan as they are now. There was no idea of insurrection on a large scale, but we were going through one of those outbreaks of dacoity which have several times proved so troublesome. Bands of marauders kept the country in confusion, pouring down on a village, now carrying off 3 or 4 of the Bombay money lenders, who were then, as now, the curse of the country, sometimes making an onslaught upon a body of traders, and occasionally venturing to attack small detachments of troops or isolated parties of police. They were not very formidable, but they were very troublesome, and most difficult to catch, for the peasantry regarded them as patriots, and aided and shielded them in every way. The headquarters of these gangs of Dacoits were the Ghauts, in the thick bush and deep valleys and gorges. There they could always take refuge, while sometimes the more daring chiefs converted these detached peaks and masses of rock, numbers of which you can see as you come up the Ghaut by railway, into almost impregnable fortresses. Many of these masses of rock rise as sheer up from the hillside as walls of masonry, and look at a short distance like ruined castles. Some are absolutely inaccessible, others can only be scaled by experienced climbers, and, although possible for the natives with their bare feet, are impracticable to European troops. Many of these rock fortresses were at various times the headquarters of famous Dacoit leaders, and unless the summits happened to be commanded from some higher ground within gunshot range, they were all but impregnable, except by starvation. When driven to bay, these fellows would fight well. Well, about the time I joined, the Dacoits were unusually troublesome. The police had a hard time of it, and almost lived in the saddle, and the cavalry were constantly called up to help them, while detachments of infantry from the station were under canvas at several places along the top of the Ghauts, to cut the bands off from their strongholds, and to aid, if necessary, in turning them out of their rock fortresses. The natives in the valleys at the foot of the Ghauts, who have always been a semi-independent race, ready to rob whenever they saw a chance, were great friends with the Dacoits, and supplied them with provisions whenever the hunt on the Deccan was too hot for them to make raids in that direction. This is a long introduction, you'll say, and does not seem to have much to do with bears, but it is really necessary, as you will see. I had joined about 6 months when 3 companies of the regiment were ordered to relieve a wing of the 15th, who had been under canvas at a village some 4 miles to the north of the point where the line crosses the top of the Ghauts. There were 3 white officers, and little enough to do, except when a party was sent off to assist the police. We had 1 or 2 brushes with the Dacoits, but I was not out on either occasion. However, there was plenty of shooting and a good many pigs about, so we had very good fun. Of course, as a raw hand, I was very hot for it, and as the others had both passed the enthusiastic age, except for pig sticking and big game, I could always get away. I was supposed not to go far from camp, because in the first place I might be wanted, and in the second because of the Dacoits; and Norworthy, who was in command, used to impress upon me that I ought not to go beyond the sound of a bugle. Of course we both knew that if I intended to get any sport I must go further afoot than this, but our Miller used to say, "All right, sir, I will keep an ear to the camp," and he on his part never considered it necessary to ask where the game which appeared on the table came from. But in point of fact I never went very far, and my servant always had instructions which way to send for me if I was wanted; while as to the Dacoits, I did not believe in their having the impudence to come in broad daylight within a mile or 2 of our camp. I did not often go down the face of the Ghauts. The shooting was good, and there were plenty of bears in those days, but it needed a long day for such an expedition, and in view of the Dacoits, who might be scattered about, was not the sort of thing to be undertaken except with a strong party. Norworthy had not given any precise orders about it, but I must admit that he said one day, "Of course you won't be fool enough to think of going down the Ghauts, Hastings." But I did not look at that as the equivalent to a direct order. "Whatever I should do now," the colonel put in, on seeing a furtive smile on the faces of his male listeners. However, I never meant to go down, though I used to stand on the edge and look longingly down into the bush, and fancy I saw bears moving about in scores. But I didn't think I should have gone into their country if they had not come into mine. One day the fellow who always carried my spare gun or flask, and who was a sort of shikaree in a small way, told me he had heard that a farmer, whose house stood near the edge of the Ghauts some 2 miles away, had been seriously annoyed by his fruit and corn being stolen by bears. I said, "I'll go and have a look at the place tomorrow. There is no parade, and I can start early. You may as well tell the mess cook to put up a basket with some tiffin and a bottle of claret, and get a boy to carry it over." "The bears not come in day," Rahman said. "Of course not," I replied. "Still, I may like to find out which way they come. Just do as you're told." The next morning at 7 o'clock I was at the farmer's spoken of, and there was no mistake as to the bears. A patch of Indian corn had been ruined by them, and 2 dogs had been killed. The native was in a terrible state of rage and alarm. He said that on moonlight nights he had seen 8 of them, and they came and sniffed around the door of the cottage. "Well, why don't you fire through the window at them?" I asked scornfully, for I had seen a score of tame bears in captivity, and, like you, Mary, was inclined to despise them, though there was far less excuse for me, for I had heard stories which should have convinced me that, small as he is, the Indian bear is not a beast to be attacked with impunity. Upon walking to the edge of the Ghauts there was no difficulty in discovering the route by which the bears came up to the farm. For a mile to the right and left the ground fell away as if cut with a knife, leaving a precipice of over 100 feet sheer down, but close by where I was standing was the head of a watercourse, which in time had gradually worn a sort of cleft in the wall, up or down which it was not difficult to make one's way. Further down this little gorge widened out and became a deep ravine, and further still a wide valley, where it opened upon the flats far below us. About half a mile down, where the ravine was deepest and darkest,
was a thick clump of